Moving on to the third panel of the evening, we have with us here Chitra, Viraghavan, Akash Kapur, and Simin Patel, who will be talking about exploring the country's aspirations through its cities. Without much ado, I shall quickly introduce our panelists for the evening. Chitra Viraghavan is a Chennai-based author. Her debut novel, The Americans, published in 2014, was set in 5 different cities across the United States. She has also co-edited a soon-to-be-released anthology called Madras on My Mind, A City in Stories, which comprises both fiction as well as non-fiction, 20 pieces by different writers, some in translation. She has also worked as a textbook writer, having written primary school books for the NCERT syllabus. Our second panelist for the evening, Simin Patel, runs Bombay Wala, a blog that highlights and historicizes the built environment of contemporary Bombay. She has recently completed her PhD in the social history of the Parsis of colonial Bombay from the University of Oxford, and she is currently working on a book on chronicling the city's iconic Irani cafes, along with photographer Hashim Badani. Akash Kapur, who will be moderating the session, is a writer based out of Pondicherry. His non-fiction book, India Becoming, was published in 2012. A French edition came out in 2014, and a Marathi edition is in the offing. His writings have appeared in publications such as The Atlantic, The Economist, and The New Yorker, among others. He also consults in the field of using technology for development and has worked on research projects with organizations such as the United Nations Development Programme and the Markle Foundation. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out on Monday night. So I'd prepared an introduction as well, but now that's been done. I just wanted to say that Simin, as she said, is writing a book on Irani cafes, so she's available for dinner recommendations after we're done, or questions at the end of the panel. So I'm not really sure why I'm up here, because my book was mostly set in the countryside, and I have never lived in a city in my life, actually. But I guess that's why I'm moderating, and we've got the city experts here. Let me just start by asking both of you a question which sort of sets the broad context of urbanization in India. In sort of researching for this panel, I came across these numbers. According to the World Bank, 130 million people have migrated over the last 10 years from the countryside to the cities, and another 250 million more in the next 15 years. So that's more than the entire population of the United States in about 35 years. Chitra, if you'd like to start, I mean, what do you think that does? How does that change the country? Physically, I mean, but also psychologically, what does it do to the sort of identity of the country?
Not just, did you say a third of the population? No, the population of the US, more than that. And in a quarter of the space, I think. So the pressure on person per square inch or a square foot is much, much greater. I think what we'll find is that cities, at least in the south, you live in Auroville, which is just a little outside Pondicherry, and I live in Chennai, which I prefer to call Madras. Just traveling down the East Coast Road, it's difficult to know where the city ends, really. It just seems to be continuing on and on and on. And lots of villages have now become part of Chennai. I don't know if you followed that news. It's become Greater Chennai. What it really means is there will be lots of villages that are part of Chennai, which think they're part of Chennai. There's no infrastructure. There are no facilities of any type. There are also places in the city like that. And so I think it's all going to be in a state of flux. We're talking about cities and identities. And how can we ever define one's identity in the context of a city? It's always going to be, you know, the comparison would be to desire. The minute you reach a particular place, you know, the object of desire shifts. And so I think it's just going to lead to lots of, it already has lots of social ferment and lots of divisions. And it's already happening. There's just a lot of too much pressure on land, on soil, on water, on air. We're seeing it happen every day.
I think there'll be obviously many more urban identities created, and looking at my research, when the Parsis moved to Bombay, for example, there was a desire to be the Parsis of Bombay and embrace an urban identity. So, I mean, I don't think it's as pessimistic. There'll be a lot of rural people, in some sense, wanting to become urban. The links between the city and the village will obviously exist, but I think the desire to become urban will persist. And I think there'll be more interesting identities created as a result. Even, for example, the South Indians, when they came to Bombay in the 1920s and 30s, and the identity of South Indian, as Nikhil Rao shows, was created in the setting of Matunga in the 1920s and 30s, and was a distinctly urban identity. In some sense, what happened to the Parsis is also understood as an urban identity. They wanted to be the Parsis of Bombay and not, say, for example, the Parsis of the outstations, of the Mofassal, of the village, etc. So I think, in the contemporary sense, I think there's an optimism of more people becoming urban and an increase in the cosmopolitanism of a city as a result.
So that's interesting. I mean, you talk about people wanting to become, to develop urban identities. You know, what is an urban identity? What characterizes it? You mentioned cosmopolitanism,
Right.
Optimism. Is
Right.
it modernity? I mean, what is an urban
absolutely.
identity?
It's a modernity. It's an optimism. It's a rejection of traditions, in some sorts of traditional mores. In the case of the Parsis, for example, they wanted to level, say, private and public spaces across the city, and they did that largely by wearing shoes. So their idea was not to remove shoes at the entrance of a home or in public spaces and wear them continuously. And basically, they wanted to align the public and the private in the city. So it's a modernity. Initially, it was a kind of sobriety. Now it's a more optimistic modernism, but their bodies and themselves were becoming modern, basically. So modernity is obviously key. So is a certain degree of cosmopolitanism, but also ghettoization and group formations would also be part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask you also, Chitra, you know, what's interesting is to think about these things not as a national phenomenon, but they're different in different parts of the country. So tell us what's happening in Chennai.
Just to complicate it a bit and add class to it, what happens a lot in South India is caste consciousness. And one finds that there are lots of people who try to escape the caste divisions in their villages, and, you know, for instance, in rural Tamil Nadu and southern Tamil Nadu, these divisions are quite clear and specific and sometimes even violent. And so, you know, for instance, in the case of two people from different communities wanting to get married, a lot of them run away to Chennai or to, I think, possibly to Coimbatore and to the other cities. And so there is that type of urban identity being created as well, where you're cutting yourself off from your past, from, you know, your cultural roots, your social history, and so on, to create your life anew in the city. And but then, of course, that has its own complications and issues, and we often hear of really horrifying things happening. But anyway, we'll keep it positive.
No, I think that's actually interesting because, you know, when we talk about urbanization, we often tend to be very negative, and we'll talk about some of the negatives of urbanization, pollution, infrastructure, all that stuff. But it is true, and I've seen this myself, that there's a kind of melting pot quality to the cities that you were just referring to. There's a kind of emancipation, the freedom of the cities. So there are these sort of positive aspects of the cities.
Yes, but to compare, for instance, Chennai to a city like this one, Bombay, there was I think, in its history, and I'm maybe making huge assumptions here because I really don't know, but the sense of Bombay as a city that is constantly on the move, that is trying to renew itself, that is, the sort of a melting pot of different types of people, and above it all is the desire to succeed and to be someone, and driven mostly by capital. But from that comes the same cosmopolitan a culture that you talk about, because people realize that they need to be bigger than just their little community, or because it makes sense, it makes business sense. But from that, one positive is that people want to get along, and I think that's much less so in the South. I don't know what you would say, Akash, to that. The sense of cosmopolitan culture, at least in Chennai, I don't know. I don't know if it exists. Maybe it did in Hyderabad, where I lived as a child. But that's been eroded too, for very many reasons, some of which I won't name now.
Yeah.
Just a small point on Calcutta, bringing Calcutta in. Historically, I mean, there was an unease with Bengalis in the city, and particularly with Calcutta, in the way that Bombay people sort of took the readiness to take to the city wasn't as evident. So the countryside always had a very prominent role in the imagination of, say, Bengali nationalists and intellectuals, and in the way that you always referred to the countryside. Women in the city, again in Calcutta, not such an easy equation. If you look at, say, Satyajit Ray, Mahanagar, or some of the Kaligat paintings where, women sitting on chairs, kind of modern furnishings were basically suspect. The woman's character was suspect with, say, Western furnishings. You don't get that so much in Bombay. So, I mean, I'm just pitching my city, but the relationship between people and cities is different. And in this case here, I think there's a greater readiness to be urban in some places.
So let me ask you, we've talked about, in a way, what you'd call the positive aspects of a city and the sort of the modernity and the cosmopolitanism. What about the clash between the identity that comes in, the identity that exists in the effort to create a new identity? I mean, there's this, Sunil Khilnani in The Idea of India refers to cities as bloated receptacles of every hope and frustration. And we've talked about hope, but let's talk about the frustration.
Sorry, these are all historical examples and not from the contemporary setting. But in the case of Iranis, these Persian Zoroastrian migrants who came to Bombay, I sort of argue in my research that the identity of Irani was formed in Bombay as to move away from the Parsi identity. So they were understood as Persian Parsis at some point, these Irani cafe owners, etc. But eventually they molded themselves into Iranis largely because they were being grouped with lower class Parsis and the Parsi poor when they first came from Persia. So you also take identities to escape some of the identities that have been thrust on you. So in that sense, the identity of Irani as the identity of the South Indian had to be created to cope with the pressures of the city. So South Indians in Matunga created this identity because they were being pushed out by other regional forces. So, I mean, these are some of the frustrations, I guess.
Yes, in the context, for instance, of the Chennai floods, what has happened and what is happening is that several thousands of people, 500 people died, and very many of them were people living on the floodplains of, there are 3 rivers in Madras, and one of them, the Adayar, the floodplains were just knocked off all the shanties and little huts. 500 people died. And right now there's a question of what do you do with these people who are there, because they were encouraged by the government, previous government, to come and settle in any land that was central to the city so that, they could have services, they could have livelihood, they could have access to healthcare. And now what do you do with these people? Because a previous government had relocated such people to a place far away, and that's become a complete it's a disaster, a social disaster. There's crime, there's, all sorts of, there's just people hanging around at home because they can't afford the transport to take them back to work, to the city. And it's going to happen again. So then what is an identity in that context when you're fighting every day for your life? And any day, the floodgates could be opened because someone has not governed properly, and then you're just swept away to your death. So where is the question of any identity in that case? I'm coming across as very black in this whole thing. But I feel quite strongly about it, that we can sit here and debate about this because we are in a position to do so. And there are people who come to the city, it's just being in the city is aspirational for them. And once they come there, what do you do with their dreams? Because their needs are not met. So where do you take those dreams? What do you do with those dreams? And in that case, do they have a sense of identity? I don't know.
Somebody once referred to this process of migration and rural people coming into urban India resulting in a clash of centuries. And with all the problems that brings, do you think that that's part of what happens when you've got these different identities meeting?
I guess so. It's also that when you come into the city, you have a certain idea of what it is like. And your personality is actually shaped in reaction to the village or small town that you were from, where you're still pretending to be, this big person from the city. But in the city, you're terrified. You're trying to find your way. And, just to take it back to the anthology that I've been co-editing, there's one artist who's written a story, well, his own life, in Tamil, which I translated with his help. And he talks about the terrible fear and so on that he feels, even just getting into a bus and then seeing a hoarding and then getting off at the wrong stop because the same hoarding is in that stop. And it's just a sense of dislocation and confusion while maintaining to the people back home that you're fine, you've succeeded, and so on and so forth. So, yeah. So.
Do you want to say something about the clash of centuries? Do you have anything on?
There will be different, traditional modes and ways of living that will be brought in with people from different places, but I don't think necessarily, they will be appropriated, there will be a certain amount of clash, but they will exist with new forms that they find in the city. For example, like Bombay's mill workers, they're a sort of classic example of that, where in the mills they had traditional forms that from the village, as well as the modern forms of capitalism that they were finding in the city, new ways of cosmopolitan living, the new structure of the chawl in which they had to stay. And the chawl, for example, does that. It has older forms and newer forms. And the typology of a chawl is actually a good way of thinking of different forms of living, I guess, in one setting.
If I could just pick that up from there. There have been a whole lot of people coming to Chennai from the northeast, and they haven't faced any, as far as I understand and I see from the papers, they haven't faced the kind of backlash that they have in other places in India, whether it's Bangalore or even Delhi. But the thing that they've done is they've completely transformed the way people live. And, there are 10 young men who come and occupy a place, thereby, like a lower middle class, lower income group house, thereby completely spoiling the economic situation of the locals, even with regard to rents, what they can afford, transport, all those types of different. So again, there are different types of formations, I think, that happen all across India. And all of this will have to kind of contribute to anybody's sense of identity. As far as Chennai is concerned, I think all of us are flood victims in a way. And it's going to be part of our identity. And I think it's important that it is.
Okay, so, as I said earlier, I find it very interesting to think about the differences in experiences across cities. So maybe it's a good time for you to read your passages, because you're writing about different cities. You want to go first?
Okay. Do you want should we just, okay, I can sit, I guess. So basically, I'm reading a bit from my dissertation, which is, basically I'm arguing that I'm talking about the enormous urban transformations in Bombay in the 1860s, which was really the most important decade in Bombay's history. The 1860s were a time when the fort walls of Bombay were demolished and an open urban metropolis was created in which we are sitting today. It's also fitting to read this, I think, because we're a building away from the Esplanade Hotel, also known as Watson's Hotel, which was really the first grand hotel in the city. Very important structure, which is in very poor shape at the moment. It really defined the city. If the two things that defined the city, it was the ramparts, the fort walls before they were destroyed, and then this new hotel, which was doing very different things. So I'm just going to read a section called Within or Without the Fort Walls of Bombay, the City and Change in the 1860s. There was little sense of loss of history or heritage among Bombay's citizens when the century-old fort ramparts were demolished in 1864. The stone walls and 3 gateways that bounded the nucleus of the colonial port city had come to be regarded as a nuisance and sanitary hazard that had long outlived its purpose. The Public Works Department resolved that the debris of the condemned ramparts would be disposed of in new construction or reclamation projects. Perhaps the only gesture in keeping with the city's brisk culture of commemoration was the publication of a portfolio of 26 views of the late fortifications of Bombay in February 1864, as the last ramparts were being removed. Publicly, only the powerful name and address of the fort survived to remind the city of its original configuration as a militarized space. Yet even the address of the fort had lost some of its luster. Prior to the ramparts' removal, spaces across the Bombay were legally defined in relation to the fort as being within or without the fort walls of Bombay. With the walls removed, spaces and addresses in the city would have to be conceptualized in new and independent ways. The 1860s were arguably the most significant decade in Bombay's colonial history, as the town transformed from a fortified settlement to the center of an open modern metropolis. On the area and environs freed by the removal of the ramparts, a new landscape of imposing civic structures in neo-Gothic style emerged, as well as a circular complex of commercial buildings, the Elphinstone Circle, which is today the Horniman Circle, and the first state-sanctioned hotel with a novel cast iron framework, the Esplanade Hotel. The symbol and structures of the ramparts on the one hand and the Esplanade Hotel on the other powerfully encapsulate how the city was being reimagined and rebuilt to accommodate the modern mobile condition. The narrow gateways of the fort through which 2 country carts and subsequently conveyances could not pass abreast or cross each other, and which during periods of rioting offered strategic points at which commuters could be blocked and attacked, had created and controlled the traffic of people and goods in Bombay. The Esplanade Hotel's Minton-tiled entrance and grand staircase beckoned the population of visitors to the city, offering over 100 bedrooms, carriage pickup and drop services to stations, a steam lift, a doctor on call, all at prices on par with and often lower than the older hotels in the city. In the open, emerging metropolis, it was good to be a stranger. An urban consciousness of the transformation of the city was evident from the early 1860s. The news of the rampart removal spurred the publication of a number of different kinds of texts on the city, urban biographies as they have been recently called, historical tours of the cityscape that also engaged with the contemporary social milieu of the city. The Bombay Gazette ran a series called Some Changes in Bombay from 1829 to 1862 through the months of May and June. Written by a British correspondent who had spent 33 years in the city, the series took the reader on an extensive tour of the cityscape, starting at Apollo Pier, moving towards Colaba, retracing our steps southward west to Cooperage, past Marine Lines, down Patel Road, and eventually to Mahim, and then back southwards to end in the nucleus. of the fort. Themes of the past, present, and future of the city predominate the literature, while the timelessness of the writing suggests a nascent culture of preservation, the last tours of the old fort. I quote, "We are those who like to look at the past while they enjoy the present and hopefully look forward to the future," read the opening lines of the series. Another text, Govind Narayan's 400-page tour de force, Mumbai Chivartan in Marathi, was published in 1863, was an astonishingly modern rendering of the city, both in its acknowledgement of the forces of technology and capital, as well as in the assuredness, aesthetic sensibilities, and cosmopolitanism of the authorial voice. In the foreword to the English translation to the book, historian Gyan Prakash notes, as Govind Narayan describes Mumbai's sights and sounds, he suggests that we are witnessing the emergence of something new. He presents himself as an observer of this emergent reality, taking us on a guided tour of its wondrous social and cultural landscape.
Thank you. I have some questions, but why don't you read first and then... No, go ahead. You mind
if I sit there? I mean, if I stand. Yeah, go for it. No, I just actually... This is from a story of mine called Split Ends, which is going to be part of the Madras anthology. I'll just set up the story for you. It's about a 17-year-old boy. His name is Arjun, and he's from a troubled home. And he and his mother are alone in the world. She runs a beauty parlor, and he lives in a sort of a thatch-roofed house above the beauty parlor. And the section that I'm reading from takes place on East Coast Road, which is one of the critical roads connecting Chennai and many parts south, including Pondicherry. And it takes place in a car. And there are two other people other than Arjun. There are Raja and Jojo. Jojo is his friend. Raja dislikes him. So that's really basically all you need to know. The car turned onto East Coast Road and stopped at a shop. Raja and Jojo got off to buy something. He could see the white and brown red striped walls and tower of the Marundishwara temple. How big the tower had seemed when he was young. His mother and he would take 23A from Besant Nagar, get off at Tiruvanmayur bus terminus, and cross that great big river of a road to get to the temple every Monday evening. She said that it was the day of the medicine god. He hadn't thought much of all that, only about the divine smell of turmeric and chili-flavored eats frying in the sweet shop on the way back to the terminus. His mother would buy him an oil-stained newspaper cone of crisp hot onion pakoda, and they would get into the bus that took them home. He craned his neck to see if the sweet shop was still there, at the exact point where the road bent south. It was gone. Jojo and Raja climbed back in. Jojo tossed a phosphorescent bag of chips at him. Arjun tore it open and jammed a hasty fistful into his mouth. The chips tasted slightly burnt, but he didn't care. Salt stung his lips. He took another swig of beer. Jojo turned round to look at him. More beer? Not done yet, thanks, he mumbled. Raja flattened the accelerator. The car took the road like something, the city took the road like something possessed. Arjun could feel his heart untether, billowing and floating freely in his chest. He braced himself against the seat in front of him. Buildings, people, cars blurred together. Jojo and Raja laughed like ghouls. He felt the smell of fear rising up into his mouth. Hey, slow down, man, you're crazy. You don't want to die today, is that it, man? Mocked Raja. You have something to live for? What is it? Is it your mother's beauty parlor? Tell me, da. Something cold and powerful unfurled within him. He wanted to smash the beer bottle over Raja's head, hear the scrunch of glass against skull, feel the smooth rip of skin, the tangle of tissue and hair, the smell of blood and beer. I'm going to skip on a bit. They crossed the toll gate on ECR and went through a small crowded village with the multiplex cinema positioned incongruously on one side, its parking lot full of expensive cars and aimless Sunday folk. Jojo giggled and said something to Raja, pointing out a poster of a blonde-wigged movie star in his latest blockbuster, Rajnikant, but couldn't hear what it was. He stared at the farmhouses set in deep gardens and gloomy sun-streaked orchards on both sides of the road, owned by people who'd been smart enough to snap up land in the 70s. Small sandy lanes stretched away between the properties towards the east, and now and then he could see brief snatches of shimmering sea. A long, elegant stretch of backwater passed under the road at Muttukadu. He couldn't tell whether the cars on the bridge were coming or going. A few catamarans dotted the backwater. The fishermen still and silhouetted, as though in some other place in time. Far away, the breakers crashed, white against a thin strip of sand. Past the bridge, close to the sea on the left, was a beach resort of the type favored by Raja. Arjun could not take any more showing up of his inadequacies. To his relief, the car sped on towards Mahabalipuram, past the casuarina groves, their floors mosaicked with pink, blue, and green plastic bags abandoned by remorseless picnickers. A sudden long stretch of sea came into view. It looked like land, still and dark. Both sides of the road fell away. He could see a fishing village set asterisk style in a sea of land owned by someone the locals called the Lord of 1,000 Acres, so he had heard tell. They passed tiger caves and turned the corner for the final short stretch towards Mahabs. Sculptors' yards with stone carvings of elephants, bulls, and rampant lions casually lined the road. I'm skipping on a bit. They got into the car. Jojo handed the last beer to Arjun. He refused it. Jojo opened the freely perspiring bottle and drank it up in one straight shot. Raja turned up the music. He made a U-turn and headed back north. Arjun felt sick with hunger and anger and beer and despair and eating at the wrong time. He lay back and closed his eyes. He remembered the time when they were little, when Veena, that's his sister, and he had come to Mahabalipuram with their mother, grandmother, and Veena's adopted parents. They had brought lunch, eaten it sitting on the rocks near the shore temple, Massed clouds over the sea had seemed to mimic the short, graceful rise of the temple tower. It had been a happy day, a child's day, without past or future, a self-contained day. When he opened his eyes, they were approaching Muttukadu Bridge. He couldn't tell whether the cars on the bridge were coming or going. As they crossed, he saw a fisherman step out of his boat with a net in his hands and walk on the water. He had to have a plan. He had to get away. It was now, or it would be too late. It was always quicker going back home from Mahabs, the salt heaps by the side of the backwater near the road to Kelambakam, 3 coconut stumps sticking out of the water like a Nat Geo photo, the spreading tree with the shrine inside the hole in its trunk, all flashed by. They had to slow down as they approached the city with its tangle of cars and people and share autos and cattle islands. At Jojo's house, Raja stopped the car and barely waited for them to get out before he took off.
Thank you. So, Simin, let me ask you, you're reading, you do this very fascinating layered historical research. Tell me about how history can inform our understanding of urbanization in the present.
It's complicated. Well, I mean, it can help you understand change. What I'm suggesting from all this is that everyone was quite ready for change. And then you look at the blog I run, and it's all about resisting change. And so it's, I guess it's complicated. But I think it would be interesting if the fort walls had survived in Bombay, and if we entered this space through 3 gates. And I think Gaul in Sri Lanka is a very fine example of that, a surviving fortified settlement, which is also a very lovely town and the best location in Sri Lanka. So I think sometimes Bombay has been too ready for change, and maybe we need to slow down and think of things. I'll think about this a little more. And
I have a follow-up question. I'll come back to you. But your piece is about the ECR, which, the East Coast Highway, which is a road I know well. And one of the fascinating things about that road is the way it's joined the metro to the small towns and the villages. And I was thinking, when I was thinking about this panel, I mean, what role do the villages in the small towns play in shaping urban identity? Because we've talked a lot about the cities in shaping national identity, but what's the connection between the tier 1, tier 2 cities and the big cities?
I think they tend to be little self-contained. They tend to be villages because, for instance, if you also take OMR into, which is a parallel road to ECR, you have, it's called the IT corridor, and it is actually responsible for a lot of the problem that Chennai is in today, because they've built up over wetlands that would have prevented this flood to some extent. In the middle of this IT highway are villages which remain villages. And strangely enough, they built a huge number of flats, which you're probably aware of, which are unoccupied. I mean, the example seems to be easier for me from OMR as opposed to ECR, because although of late I've noticed that high-rise buildings have even appeared on ECR, which really should have been governed by the coastal regulation zone code. But apparently 6 months ago, some new change has come about and they've been high rises. So basically you have a situation where you have very affluent people and then you have villages, and then there's bound to be friction, and there's bound to be some kind of change in identity based on that. All I'm seeing is that the villagers remain villagers. And they are mostly feeding off of, at least on ECR, on the temples that are there, or on the cultural formations that, for Mahabalipuram, for instance, is an example. There are some other forts further down south, I think. So when you go there, you see certain villages clustered around them. I don't see, I mean, this is a subject actually you're better equipped to answer than me. I don't see that they are benefiting as much from that road being developed, except for the fact that it's cutting into their village, it's cutting off their trees, and the road's being expanded, as you know. And I really don't know how they feel about that. That's actually something that you should answer, I think.
I mean, I guess, you know, I feel like in many ways urbanization is decimating the villages, not necessarily the villages even close to the cities, but everywhere because of this migration. And if you go into villages, you see agriculture disappearing. I mean, I don't know if that's something you found or that.
Just this time, I went to Pondicherry in December, and on the way back, the bridge had broken, and so we couldn't come back because of the floods and the rain, and so we couldn't come back directly to Chennai. We had to take a little detour, and the detour was through Kalpakkam, which is this beautiful little place, but right next to it is the nuclear facility. And so that has shot the agriculture, the land there to pieces. I mean, we're going to find out in the years to come what effect it's had on the children being born there and the children growing up there. And, you know, that's, I think, I mean, it was quite scary because it's like this beautiful thing, this place. It doesn't look like India because it's so neat and it's so clean. And right next to it is this nuclear facility. So I think we're kind of forcing our urbanization and our needs on the villages, which is, I think, what you're trying to say as well.
So the motto is that we need more nuclear power plants? Is that what you're saying? Or?
No, I think we need less.
to make urbanization a neater, cleaner process, we need more nuclear power plants.
No, I'm saying it's scary.
Yeah.
In fact, a friend of mine sent me a list of things to do, including buying wheat and saying, make a paste and keep it ready in case that bursts. You know, you then seal all your doors and all that, and be safe.
Sorry, I have a better answer. I think what we can learn is that a lot of Bombay, what we consider, I mean, sort of the heart of the city, was built with this sort of a private-public partnership where citizens and particularly philanthropists and the state work very closely together to create the landscape around us. And obviously you had big philanthropists like David Sassoon and Jamshedji Gigi Boy, Jagannath Sankar Sheth, etc. But you also had citizens, everyday people, contributing small amounts of money for little bus, for little scholarships, for lectures. And so I think that culture of the state and the citizens working together is worth emulating. And I think we're seeing some of that with the Baikala Museum and other institutions, but we need more of that. And I think the role that every citizen can play and work with the state is worth emulating in the current context.
Thanks. And I have a better question also.
Yes.
I have a better formulated question. Talk about the role of heritage conservation
Right.
in the identity of a city.
Well, I mean, there are two kinds of things that are happening with the heritage in Bombay. One is just the rampant destruction of structures that are now being removed from heritage lists and then just being demolished. But there's also a much sadder kind of thing that I think all of us are responsible for, which is the flattening of structures, the removing of little embellishments on buildings, of closing up of balconies and things like that, which is doing, I think, as much damage to the city. So eventually you'll have completely flat structures that will be much easier to demolish because there won't be anything in them that's worth preserving. So I'm not sure if, I mean, there is some sense of heritage with this part of South Bombay and things like that, but I think there's a basic lack of valuing our architectural kind of environment and the environment in which we live. Yeah, so I'm not sure how it's penetrated our identity. I'm not sure if it has to a sufficient extent.
Do you want to say something about heritage conservation, and then we can take some questions?
Just to compare Chennai with Bombay, there is a fort in Chennai as well, Fort St. George, and it's highly fortified to this day because it holds the secretariat and it has some other odd, it has the archaeological survey, I think the army has a base there. It's really not part of the citizens' consciousness. And we also have a whole set of Indo-Saracenic the university buildings, all across the marina, there are all sorts of buildings, and in different parts of Chennai. At different points, some of them have even burnt down in insurance scams. There was the LIC, there was some building on Mount Road, Spencer's, which got burnt down, and there was always the rumor that it was an insurance scam. I think awareness of the need to preserve this is growing, and we do have an Intact. I think you're a member of Intact Pondicherry, is that right? No. Okay. I don't know why I had that impression. But there are people who are interested. But I think as long as citizens, everyday citizens aren't a part of this, it isn't going to work. What we've discovered, back to my favorite subject, the floods, is that each of us has to make a contribution to the city. We can't just keep blaming the politician and saying this didn't happen, that didn't happen. There's no water, so let's get in, let's get in tankers of water from Andhra Pradesh or something. I don't think we are each doing enough, the ones who can. We are all looking at life in a very narrow kind of way, but it's very important. Like what you said, we should preserve all the little bits and pieces of not just the great, glorious buildings, and it's fine that they're being, but little people's homes and other smaller structures should be preserved too. I think it's important.
Just a point on Indo-Saracenic, that is the sort of dominant colonial architectural style in Madras, whereas in Bombay you have the Prince of Wales Museum, which is an Indo-Saracenic structure, but by and large Indo-Saracenic didn't do well in Bombay, and that's why didn't Indo-Saracenic succeed, and why is the city basically a neo-Gothic city? And historians have argued that basically because of Bombay's modernity and cosmopolitanism, they didn't want to have a style that is so closely affiliated with, say, with a religion, or they wanted a more cosmopolitan style that reflected their own modernity. So whereas Indo-Saracenic flourished in Madras, it wouldn't have worked in Bombay. And so you have this kind of Western neo-Gothic style that suited the Parsis and the Jews and the Hindus and everybody else. And in some sense, the fort didn't survive so Madras and Bombay are really two, at the opposite end. They also have a functioning fort. We had to destroy the fort. We couldn't handle the walls and the reminders of our militarized history, whereas Madras seems to be much more comfy with all these things.
Interesting. So, should we take a few questions? Anybody have any questions? Is there a mic for the audience?
Let me begin by thanking all three of you for this truly rich discussion. It's actually a sort of symposium that you've developed, so thank you very much indeed. And it's also, Simin, following from what you said, it's interesting that the Kala Ghoda festival is actually mapped between two of the three gates of the old fort, the Esplanade Gate, which is just across the library, and the Apollo Gate near Hornbill House. Yeah, but I have, actually, if I may, a question for you. Could we maybe rethink or look more closely at cosmopolitanism, even in the 1860s or through the late 19th, early 20th century? I had the impression, probably wrong, that in this discussion it came across as somehow a given, whilst actually it was crafted, it was problematic, and I wonder if you might want to address specifically a very particular Bombay housing typology, which is the Parsi Bagh. Not far from here is Khushru Bagh, designed by Claude Batley, but based very probably on Karl Marx Hof, which was workers' housing in Vienna in those amazing 1920s. So really to come to the nub of this, there's a way in which in Navsari or Valsad or Surat, communities would live in their mohallas, which were not self-enclosed.
Right.
They actually had edges, they had borders with, they were osmotic.
Right.
But it's in what you characterize as the modern city that communities create gated communities. They created gated enclaves for themselves, where to that extent they pursue an exclusionary, inward-looking sort of perspective. So that's really the question.
Okay, so in my dissertation work, I looked at the early landscape of Parsi, exclusive Parsi housing and hospitals in Bombay, which really began in the 1880s. And my sense, I look at things like compound walls and other small architectural details to suggest that that initial housing for Parsis was not to separate the Parsis from other communities in the city, as much as it was Parsi elites trying to categorize the Parsi poor and make them a respectable kind of, the lower classes in the Parsi poor into kind of a respectable community. So I argue that early Parsi housing was not a gated formation. The idea was not to separate Parsis from the city. It was to institutionalize and in some sense spatially exclude sections of the community from other sections, and to which Parsi elites could then show these shining examples of sanitary housing to the state and to other people as a comprehensiveness of their project of modernity, that even the poorest Parsi will have a sanitary home, will not be affected by the plague and things like that. We don't have any beggars, we don't have any prostitutes. And that was all crafted, I mean, in terms of the frustrations and also how carefully Cosmopolitan had to be crafted. This is exactly that example. Parsis who begged would be removed from this kind of housing. There were acts whereby Parsi prostitutes were excommunicated from the community. So how they fashioned themselves into this community is very interesting. And the baghs were that, I mean, the early housing was that type. Khushru Bagh and stuff are much later, where maybe it was doing something different. But the original form, I suggest, was an internal problem of the community and not a city problem as such.
Any other questions?
Some countries like Israel and Germany, the government has restored churches, well as in Germany and in Israel, in Jerusalem in particular, and other places, Acre, Caesarea. These edifices have been reconstructed as exact replicas of the ancient original structures. Do you think that could work out here in terms of at least the fort? There's a large piece at St. George Hospital. Or is that a pipe dream? I mean, I was struck by what you said about it's a pity about the fort getting demolished. And,
right, no, I mean, something like that could definitely be restored and, cordoned off and made accessible as a kind of tourist, venue. But I think the everyday destruction of facades that are perfectly fine, and then if you want to sit and then rework those, it's just a huge waste of resources and, money and logic. And I think I think there's an everyday destruction that is in our hands and that is being, just wasted. So, but I think things like the fort should definitely be part of the preservation efforts of the state. But I don't know if they'd be interested in that kind of history, and what they want to erase and what they want to keep is complicated, I think.